Listen-only mode.
Greetings and welcome to the latest installment of the University of Minnesota Alumni Association's webinar series. My name is John Ruzek and I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Networks for the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. Thank you to all the alumni and friends who have made time to join us live today. We're broadcasting here from the lovely McNamara Alumni Center at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. It's a sunny day here in Minnesota and glad that you're here with us. Today's webinar will cover many aspects about improving your odds for early career success. Maybe you've graduated and have successfully navigated your college to career transition. You may now be wondering, what's next? Or perhaps you're seeking more professional fulfillment through your current job or want to kickstart a search for something new. Well, our webinar is here to help you today. Today's webinar is part of a free series being offered by the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, where we're having conversations with experts about career, life, and learning topics. The webinar is being recorded and will be viewable afterwards at minnesotalumni.org/alumni webinar series. Just give us a few business days to post it on our website, and we'll also send a post-webinar email to those who attended with the recording link as well. And if you're on Twitter or if you use Twitter, definitely tweet at us during the webinar at hashtag UMNWebinar or at our Alumni Association Twitter account, UMN Alumni. We'd love to hear from you. And also a plug on our larger alumni webinar series. This is the final one in our 2014-15 webinar series. This is the 10th one that we've done this year, and we've just had tremendous participation. So thank you to all the alumni and friends who have supported this series during the past year. We've had 2,200 people tune in day of to hear these webinars and nearly 2,900 viewings of the webinars on our Alumni Association YouTube channel. So you can catch up on the entire 2014 series at our website, which is shown here, and you can catch a lot of different topics. We've had some great things along the lines of the early career success today, setting goals after the new year, LinkedIn and Twitter on the job search. We've also had some lifestyle webinars about seeing the best of the world on your next vacation, or some timely topics from this last fall about Ebola as well. So definitely check those out. They're definitely worth your time. For those of you who are in the Twin Cities, a quick save the date on our next Emerging Professionals Network event. These are a great series of networking events that we've started the last couple years, and the next one will be on June 22nd at the new St. Paul Saints Stadium in downtown St. Paul, the CHS Field. Definitely check it out. It's a beautiful venue. Save the date at this point. Registration is not live yet, but that is the info to put on your calendar. Some housekeeping items today with GoToWebinar. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speakers system by default. So if you'd prefer to listen over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane of your GoToWebinar panel, and dial-in information will be displayed. If you experience audio difficulties while listening via your computer speakers, this can be caused by having multiple software applications open, which can use up your computer's bandwidth. So definitely feel free to close any unnecessary applications on your computer. Questions are welcome, and you may submit them at any time. There'll be a couple points along the way during today's presentation where the presenters will be taking questions. And so if you'd like to type in a question, type it into the questions pane on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll pass those along. So this is going to be a good conversation, so we do want to hear from you. Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's featured speakers, and these two were actually one of the first people I approached when we started doing the webinar series, but they're last but not least. I'd like to introduce Carlene Kurtula, who is a 15-year veteran of higher education and is the Director of Program Innovation at the Opus College of Business at the University of St. Thomas. And then I'd also like to introduce my U of M colleague, Phil Miller, who's the Assistant Dean for MBA programs at the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. So Carlene and Phil, welcome to today's webinar.
Thank you, John. It's great to be here. Looking forward to spending the next hour with everyone here and having the chance to talk a little bit more about early career success, which is certainly a topic that Phil and I are both passionate about. So I wanted to share a little bit more about my background just so you can understand a bit more about where we're coming from. So John mentioned I currently work at the University of St. Thomas and have spent the last 15 years in higher education in roles running a nonprofit association that serves business schools, as well as some time at the Carlson School right here at the U. So I did start my early career, we're talking about early career success, at the Toro Company. That was my first job post my MBA. Worked in the international division there, and you'll see a picture of the Eiffel Tower because I did, during my time and tenure at Toro, spent a lot of time living and working in France. And you'll also see a quote from one of my favorite French philosophers, which is Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote Le Petit Prince, The Little Prince. Many of you may be familiar with that book. But I think the metaphor there, you and you alone will have the stars as no one else has them, is a great metaphor for a lot of things in life, but certainly applies to our career path and early career success. So we all have an opportunity to define our own path, to define success in our own way, and so no two career paths look alike. And I think you'll see that today and hopefully learn some things from us about practices that you can use to make sure that it doesn't turn out to be just luck, but actually some processes and practices that will help you be successful. And with that, I'll turn it over to Phil.
Thanks, Carlene. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So as it shows here, I work at the Carlson School of Management, but I think my career relates to a few pictures about that I'll show in a bit as we talk around indirect paths to jobs. So my background, I went through a history major and a history PhD program, decided that I did not want to be a history professor, and came here to the Carlson School more years ago than I care to admit to get my MBA. Pursued sort of a switcher's career path. Didn't know exactly what I wanted to do, took a very experiential path through the MBA program, ended up doing management consulting and then working in corporate strategy and running a global business at 3M before I came back here to the Carlson School as faculty. And along the way, I've highlighted at the bottom here a blog that I write that I've been writing for, I don't know, 8 or 10 years. I have ended up giving a lot of career advice, both through my day job, both in consulting and at 3M. I led MBA hiring and career development work for folks, but also just informally and formally as faculty member here. So I collect a lot of my thinking, and I really enjoy helping people kind of find their path in career advising. And I think oftentimes, to Carlene's point about each of us has an individual path, there are patterns and there are practices that are super helpful and likely to increase your odds, but each one creates sort of a unique path for the individual in question. So we'll get into talking a little bit about those practices now, but thanks for joining us. So with that, I like to do mind maps so you know where we're going. So here's a roadmap of what we're going to talk about. And I really think about this as increasing your odds, right? And I went with maroon and gold. Hopefully it's close enough to actual maroon and gold to go with the Alumni Association's brand standards. But we talked about this, and I've talked about this for a number of months. I really think the 6 big, bold ideas here, if you can break it down into these discrete concepts, you're off to the right. You're off on the right track, and you're building practices that are highly likely to increase the odds. And I always go back to a quote that I really like from Gary Player, but it's attributed, the golfer, but it's attributed to a number of different people. And he would always say, it's funny how the more I practice, the luckier I get. And I think that a lot of these things are patterns that if you get into them will increase your odds of success. So You have to figure out where you want to go and define your own path. We think that oftentimes, particularly for people early in their career, they lose sight of actually doing a good job, right? You can get very focused on what do I want and what is my development, but you can lose track of actually building your professional portfolio and brand and learning how to do good work, because that, in fact, is what earns you the right to do other things. We'll get into that. Building good relationships, so much of your career success is going to come through the networks you build. We'll talk a bit about that. And then having done those, how do you actually grow, right? What is your personal development path? And then how do you actually get mechanical and tactical about exploring options? Like what does it look like to explore different options? How do I begin to visualize that, create a path? And then never forget that at the end of the day, if you haven't saved money, you lose a lot of choice and flexibility, because you get to early, mid, and then later in your career, when you get to be the age Carlene and I, which I won't specify, but I'll just say we have children and we're thinking about college for those children. You know, if you don't have adequate savings, you actually lose a lot of choice and flexibility, because you can't downshift and take a lower paying job that gives you fulfillment if you don't, in fact, have sufficient cushion. So we're going to get into some sub-detail on all of these. And we'll pause about halfway through for questions and then at the end for questions. So with that, how do you define your own path? I think that too often we either get no advice or we get really directive advice, right? And I think Carlene and I have both done a lot of career advising, and both of us tend to take an approach of listening and then offering sort of challenging broad advice, but not do this, do that type of advice. So I think if you take the idea at the bottom of the slide, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there, which is the Cheshire Cat, so we got to get in our respective literary metaphors. If you take that, don't interpret that to mean I need to know exactly where I'm going, but it means I need to know broadly what I'm interested in. So early on, really explore and understand, what do you get fulfillment from? And it could be an industry. Like, I really find entertainment fascinating. I want to be a filmmaker, right? Or it could be, I really like quantitative challenges, right? It doesn't have to be an industry. It could be a skill or a type of activity you like to engage in. But what are those things, and are you self-aware, and have you gotten feedback from the environment about whether or not the market actually thinks you're good at those things? Because I think sometimes we think we're really good at something, and our parents or siblings or friends may tell us we're great at it, but does the market validate that we're good at it? The other thing I want to point out in my highly sophisticated illustration on the right-hand side of the page is, if you see this, I like this image because it shows a general direction up and to the right, right? So if you think about that as a career path, it doesn't necessarily look so different from that. When I say, do you know where you're going and what direction you picked, I mean generally, are you going in the right direction, and are the moves you make moving you in that direction? But it's going to be a really not straight line for most people. At least that's been both of our experience. Some people really know what they want. I have family that knew they wanted to be a doctor from the time they were 7, and they are now in their 50s and very happy, successful physicians. For those of you who know that, you can skip all this, right? But I think most of us it's a little more ambiguous. So with that, I'll hand it over to Carlene.
All right, great, thanks, Phil. So our next point of practice is really learn to be a professional. And I believe that this takes time and experience, and it takes some trial and error. And as I think about even the practices that I'll talk about in the next few slides, those are things that I continue to work on or continue to need reminding in terms of really building up the level of professionalism that I'm demonstrating every day on the job. So Phil alluded to this a little bit in our overview, but I think it's really important to focus on doing your job well. So this may seem obvious to some of you, but I bet all of you know someone, perhaps a current colleague, somebody you worked with in a team setting, maybe even back at the university, who always seems to skirt work, right? They always seem to be busy keeping an eye on what everyone else is doing, trying to jockey for their next position, and they spend more time and energy doing that than they do in actually working or focusing on their day job. So I would highly recommend that you not be this person, and I'm sure many of you aren't. But we live in a world of distractions and opportunities, and it's really easy to not stay focused on doing really good quality work. So that is just something I think that's critically important, and that taking shortcuts just doesn't pay. So the more we can do our job well, the better. All right, the next thing is to make things happen. And we want to make sure that we're also have had experiences where as a manager, you work with individuals you can trust because they show up, they follow through, they get things done, they make things happen, and you can really count on them to lighten your load. And this makes a big difference. So the more you can be useful in what you do, the better off it is. And this is true at whatever age and stage you are within your career. It demonstrates a high level of professionalism if you're doing useful things, if you're walking your talk, and if you're working, I would say, in an environment where this isn't happening and you're surrounded in a culture where a high level of professionalism isn't happening, move on if and when you can, because it's a lot more fun to work in an environment where you can be useful and feel useful and be appreciated for that work. And I would just add as well to try whenever you can to be as proactive as possible. So look for opportunities, anticipate whenever you can. Again, many of us work in a very distracted, volatile environments, and the more we can be proactive and have other people who are helping us be proactive, the more professional you will come across. The last thing I want to spend a little bit of time talking on in terms of professionalism is gathering regular peer feedback. And I'd ask you to focus in on the word peer, because oftentimes I think in our careers we rely on feedback from either our supervisors or people who might work for us. But in my experience, the very best people you can go to get honest and real feedback is with your peers. And I think it's important to ask for it regularly, to set up either an environment or a practice where you're actually getting the feedback from people. So I want to talk a little bit first about the kind of feedback to ask for, the ways that I think there are some practical ways that you can do it, and then a couple of cautions when you are seeking out feedback. So first of all, the kind of feedback to ask for. Phil and I discussed this in advance and really thought there's three general buckets. One, any general things about your strengths. So if you're asking someone, particularly a peer, you might say, well, how am I doing on this? Or what are my strengths? Or, you know, what did you see me doing well within the work environment this week? Those kind of questions where you're just getting general feedback on your strengths. And then sometimes it's really helpful to ask, are there skills you think I need to develop? Are there things that you see in my behavior that are causing derailers or causing people to bristle or causing conversations happening at the water cooler, so to speak? And so getting general feedback on your strengths, on your skills, and then anything that might be a derailer or that could not be going well. Ways to gather feedback. I think there's a simple exercise to, when you're having a conversation with a peer, is to fragment or orient it around stop, start, continue. So are there things that I should stop doing? Are there things that I should start doing? And are there things that you would recommend that I continue doing because they're strengths and they're working well for me? Another kind of feedback to ask for, or another way to do it, is simply to bring together a circle of peers who you can ask periodically to serve as kind of a board for you that you can run more significant ideas off of. Meet for coffee, meet simply, and just ask for regular feedback. Another thing that I've done often is to ask when I have a significant presentation or an influencing moment that I need to work on. I will ask for feedback in terms of a dry run. So either sitting down and running through the presentation with a group of peers, or saying, okay, I've got to have this difficult conversation, what feedback would you provide to me, and then practicing that with my colleagues. A couple of just cautionary notes. I think we oftentimes will have moments, all of us in our career, where things don't quite go as we anticipated. and it's really beating us up, right? We're thinking, wow, I could have done that presentation better. I could have answered that interview question a lot better. Whenever you can, seek feedback on that so it gives you a reality check. And for those of you who are in positions where you're oftentimes doubting your performance or doubting how you did, this can be really helpful to get a reality check and to better understand when your perception that something didn't go well may or may not be true. And with that, I'll turn it over to Phil.
Right. Yeah, and just to follow on to Carlene's comment, I think I often joke with folks, and I'll apologize in advance for my East Coast sarcasm, but I grew up in the Northeast. I've been here for 20 years, but I'm still have some East Coast edges. So my somewhat sarcastic response to people sometimes, but I mean it sincerely, is it's an average world, and sometimes you forget where average is. So sometimes we beat ourselves up. We think something went just terribly because we're hard on ourselves and we expect a lot of ourselves, but everyone else sort of thought it went fine. And it can vary, and my wife isn't probably listening to this, so I'm going to tell a story about my wife that's unrelated, so safe. At our wedding, the flowers that showed up in the chapel on the day of were completely wrong and not the right flowers. And my observation to her was, you're the only person out of 300 people in this room that knows that's true, so if you don't tell anyone that they're the wrong flowers, no one else would know, and they're lovely, right? So just think about that as you present yourself sometimes in your career. It's like, maybe it wasn't as bad as you think. Also, transitioning to building good relationships, I want to kind of consolidate where we are, right? So you begin to think about where you want to be. You take roles that presumably get you on that path. You're learning how to be a professional. Well, then a big part of that is, how do you project yourself out, right? How do you create a set of relationships that both support you in doing your existing job well, but create new opportunity and maybe build opportunities you hadn't even thought of, right? So a big part of this, in particular reinforcing your day job, as I think of it, is mentorship, right? And the idea of mentorship is just finding people who are further down the path than you, whatever that path may be. It may be within your function in your company. It might be an entrepreneur who's successfully launched 2 or 3 companies and you're trying to do one, right? It may just be someone you respect who's wise, who has an opinion on the ways of the world. It could be any one of those. And I think of it in my world, I had many mentors, and they don't all have to be perfect mentors on every topic, right? They can be that on 1 or 2 things. So find that support and advice and be open to the feedback. To Carlene's point about a board of advisors, I honestly think, and I wrote on this a long time ago, think about it as a personal board of directors, right? How do you find folks who can give you a range of feedback and just advice from different angles, but that's safe, right? And so part of finding mentorship is, it may or may not be your boss, but I often encourage people to find people outside of your chain of command or outside your immediate day-to-day or your family to serve as a mentor, because then they can both be more open and you can take it not as personally. And I find that depending on how sensitive you are to feedback, like my observation with my children is, however much advice I may give to people that are not my children, whatever advice is given to my children is not necessarily received in the spirit with which it's intended, right? So find these relationships. And who I would go to ask for advice about how to get a pay raise is different than who I would go to ask advice on how to launch a business, which is different probably than who I might go to ask advice on how to do a presentation, right? So figure that out, but then have the courage to reach out. Here's my other another observation for you. For those of you who are a bit younger or earlier in your career, I think you'll be surprised at how open people are to doing this. You just need to have the courage to ask. Particularly in the context of an alumni call, I give this advice to our current students and alumni. Very few honest and open requests to meet or for advice are declined. Most people want to help. So go find some mentors. I think then the next step is building a network. And I think about building a network in several ways, and let me start with the benefits to building a network. I think first, people talk about networking and sometimes we fall into this trap of thinking about it as schmoozing or something that's unappealing and kind of icky. I don't think of it that way. I think if you're thinking about it that way, I would agree with those characterizations. I would think about it more as if you are in fact useful, as Carlene was talking about, and you have a perspective and you either need help or have something to offer, how do you build positive, supportive relationships with an ever broader group of people such that you're stitching a useful network together for each other? So I don't think of it as value extraction, right? It's not, hi, Phil, I need this thing from you. I think of it as like reciprocal positive relationships. So, hey, I'm interested in this thing that you may have a perspective on. Could you share your perspective? And then do you reciprocate when they need help, right? So the idea of a network is value travels through that network, not just in one direction. So if you're just trying to get jobs and you're reaching out to people, you know, in the month or two before you need a new job, people will understand and perceive it in that way, versus you're authentically engaging, you're going to trade association meetings, you're going to an interest group meeting, you're reaching out for informational interviews, sending interesting articles along to people you've met, staying in touch. People treat that really positively. So I think that's really important. Why it can help you. I think it's important in your day job. My observation being in both large and small organizations, the people who are better networked in a large organization know more and can get things done more quickly, because very few decisions get taken immediately and travel in a straight line. So the extent to which you can skip 3 steps and get right to the person who has the information is hugely valuable, and knowing more is always better. The other thing I would observe in my own experience, very few of my job opportunities have come outside of my network, because I usually am pretty happy where I am, and every move I've made has generally come from a call. You know, both Carlene and I are currently in jobs that we got when we got a phone call from someone who we'd worked with or had a strong prior relationship with. And since I graduated from the MBA program in the mid to late 90s, each change I've made since on-campus recruiting when I graduated has been directly a result of a network connection and someone either running into someone or someone reaching out to me, not me actively looking. So I find, particularly for those of you, I mean, this is true in any market, I think particularly in the Twin Cities, for those of you who are here, I never know if this is a big small town or a small big town, but lots of people know each other, and to the extent that you've done the earlier steps in terms of building a positive brand, and then you get out there, I think there's lots of opportunities that you can create. And then finally, you know, be helpful. As I said, you get a lot of positive goodwill when you are useful to others when you don't have to be, right? It's sort of like, you know, the old ethics question, or, you know, are you moral, do you do the right thing when no one's watching? I mean, this is a little bit like that. I think when people reach out, are you positive and are you helpful? Which doesn't mean, do you stop everything and put 1,000 hours of work into somebody else's thing? That's not what I mean. That's kind of ridiculous. What I do mean is, are you a gracious introducer of people to other people? If somebody needs advice and asks for 30 minutes in an informational interview, do you reciprocate and do you do that and make yourself available? If you have some special knowledge, do you share it, right? Those kinds of things. I think what you'll find, as I said earlier, is lots of these things are pretty simple to do and don't take a ton of time. They just take being purposeful and intentional. And I'll give you an example that kind of rolls these things up. I actually track my networking, and I've done that more formally or less formally. But I would challenge you each to think about what a meaningful target is, and track yourself on a monthly basis, because if it matters to you, you should measure it. So one fear I had when I went to 3M, right? 3M's in Maplewood, and it can become, that campus there can become very constraining, right? It's a pain in the neck in the winter to get off, and you're almost over into Wisconsin, so it's hard, you know, not always easy to get back to Minneapolis during the day for lunch or whatnot. So I made a very conscious effort, and I had a target of 10 connections a month with people, and I sort of defined it as 5. I think I defined it as 6 at 3M and 4 outside 3M, because I thought I could do 4 things a month outside 3M pretty readily. And then I defined it as 3, you know, half new connections and half renewing existing connections, because I'm a consultant, so I want a 2x2 matrix. But if you think about it in some sort of systematic way, and then if you link that back to well, where am I trying to get and what direction am I trying to head from an earlier point, that helps you define sort of proactively the kinds of people you should be reaching out to, and then helps you keep on track. So I literally put it in a spreadsheet and kind of visualize it, partly because I'm super ADD and I need to see it in front of me for it to be useful. So with that, we're going to pause, take a refreshing break in the middle, and see if there's any questions on anything we've talked about so far before we plow on.
All right. Phil and Carlene, I realize I might not have launched them earlier. Did you still want to, we had a couple poll questions. Would you like me to do those right now, or should we just go into questions?
Let's just go into questions.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. First one, Alumna would love some tips for how to manage those early in their career journey. So it sounds like they're maybe a manager of these people at the early career stage. Any advice particularly for managers of these folks?
I'll take that. So I think a couple thoughts come to mind immediately. One, set an example, right? So kind of be what you want to see from them, because they're going to model your behavior. So I think it's just like parenting or being a boss anywhere, is make sure that you're showing what you would expect them to be. So don't ask them to be in earlier, don't ask them to be in later, don't send informal emails if you want them to send formal emails, however that works out in your workplace. I think that's one kind of basic concept. The other thing I would say developmentally is, I think this gets into the coaching and how you engage them piece, how you deliver feedback and help them grow, I think, is really important. And one is in their day job, like keeping them focused, particularly in their first year. I think what I find interesting, and this is a bit of a millennial thing, but I don't know that it's that different than it was 15 years ago when I was first managing people. Early in their career, people all want to be, the general manager of the billion-dollar business in 10 years. What even the timeline of the company might say it's going to take 25. And so I think it's helping them learn to be good at the thing they're doing and be focused on the thing they're doing, while also having that developmental conversation and laying out for them what that future might look like. So I think there's sort of I don't know if it's a left hand, right hand, on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, you have to do well and showing them what that looks like and providing immediate tactical support. So like in my organization, that means making sure people get the right Excel training and making sure that people early in their career actually get a project management class and know how to do some of those things that when you're further on in your career, you may forget that you actually had that training 20 years ago. Make sure they get that and that there's a plan. But then also be open to those longer-term conversations as appropriate. I mean, I don't know if that is too high level, but I think it's balancing the short term and the long term. But then being open and not prejudging, because they're all going to come with a different style. And some kids are super aggressive and linear and they know what they want to do, and other people don't know. So I think it's sort of how flexible are you in responding. For me as a coach, I just feel like my job is to help folks be the best them they can be, not how to make them be like me, right? So there's a lot of listening and sort of figuring out. And you'll find as you get on in your career, there's patterns, like there's types. There's not a single answer.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, John. I just wanted to build on what Phil was talking about, just in terms of being really open. So I have a friend who runs a successful nonprofit that serves a younger population, younger generation, and so she has both what she calls a big board, which is kind of people more advanced in their career who help her manage the nonprofit, but then she also has a board of really young and energized people, and her advice always is harness the energy, because typically young people are excited, they have a lot of energy, and so to work hard not to squell that, if you will, too much, but to really figure out a way to harness it in meaningful ways, because you can get a whole lot of work done. Like she said, I'm just so energized when I come out of those meetings, and my big board is constantly talking about analysis, and we got to move slowly, and so I think if you can harness the energy of your employees and give them meaningful assignments, but really give them a little bit of room to explore and grow, and even maybe make some mistakes, I think that's really valuable.
I agree, and I have just one last thing, and then we'll get to the next question. I think, we've seen in the sharing economy and in Wikipedia, there's whole books written on this, the amount of time and energy people will put in for free to things they care a lot about. So if you create an environment where people feel valued and see these growth, they'll give you a lot more than their 40 hours a week or whatever your standard engagement is, to the extent that they feel not supported or tightly controlled or constrained. You're going to get your 40 and be haggling when you need hour 41. So I just think how you give feedback and how you engage people is really important.
Mm-hmm. I have another question from a participant who's, I believe, 1 year into a job right out of college, and her question is, what do you do when you start to not like your job or you start to feel undervalued in that job? So again, 1 year right out of college.
So I'll jump in, and we're actually going to hit on this. Like, I have a major section of this is,
okay, then
when's it time to go?
Sure.
So I'm going to hit on a little bit, and then I'm going to defer, and we can come back around to that in the Q&A if we haven't gotten to it. But I think my basic placeholder questions would be, are you still learning, and or do you see any other path at that company? And then we'll get to like a little bit of when is it time to stay or go in a few slides.
Okay. Yeah, and just one more question before we jump back to your slides. One guest today writes, a challenge I've had is communicating about myself. I have a tendency to be open and frank about my performance, especially with making mistakes, with the aim to acknowledge what has happened and move on from there. He says this has been met with mixed results. Do you have any ideas?
I do. I think this gets back to what we were saying earlier about calibration. And I'll go back. My dad, he's not listening, so I'll admit that he was a wise man that I actually learned things from. I wouldn't say that to him directly, probably, but I'm kidding. He observed to me very early on, like I want to say I was in middle school or high school, and I was like running to be on some board of student government or something. I don't remember what it was. And I was very, aw shucks, I don't do a very good job. And he was in a leadership position at a Fortune 500 company and had been in sales. He's like, well, if you don't sell yourself, who do you expect is going to? So I think if you hold that as one thought, and then you hold the thought also that I said earlier is like, do you really know how other people felt about your performance? Because what you don't want to do is be overly critical of yourself and convince people that they're not happy with performance they might otherwise have been happy with. So I think I would always start with a question. So before you start tearing yourself down, I would ask other people, how'd it go? And if they're like, it really didn't go very well, then you say, well, what do you think could be better? Not, yeah, you're right, I messed up A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. When maybe they just thought you messed up A and they didn't think it was that bad. So I think if you lead with questions, just like the big slide in front of you says, that helps. But I also think that that sense of calibration, and it's a fine line between overly self-promoting versus just being confident. Mm-hmm. But I think that if you overdo the self-critique, then people lose faith in your confidence, and that's actually worse, or is really problematic, particularly if you want to get promoted or move on, right? So that, I don't know, Carlene, anything to add?
Yeah, and I would just add that that's where I think that notion of peer feedback is really valuable, right? Because oftentimes peers, unless you're in a really competitive organization, a really competitive environment, getting the feedback from your peers is a lot easier than going to your manager and saying, oh, I messed this up, You don't want to put that tape reel, if you will, too much into their mind, or that messaging too much into their mind. But peers, it's a little bit easier to do that with because you can get more genuine feedback, and I found, frankly, more helpful feedback.
Okay.
Awesome.
And not put those things at risk.
So as we transition on to then how do I grow as an individual?
Yep. So individual growth, I think it's really important to develop a growth mindset. And I love this quote because I think it shows that that's every individual's personal responsibility is to take ownership of their own personal growth. And so I love the work of Carol Dweck in this area, who's a PhD psychologist out of Stanford. And she talks about and wrote a book called Mindset, which I would highly recommend if it's not something you've read or have seen. But it's basically a concept that is fairly simple, where she talks a lot about how people approach challenges and obstacles. And some people approach those things with a fixed mindset, which means they tend to operate on the premise that intelligence is static. People with a growth mindset, when faced with a challenge or an obstacle, tend to believe that intelligence can be developed. And so they really are open to learning, they're open to trying new things, and they really and truly believe that they can learn things and can get better at things. And so when faced with a challenge, for example, if you enter into it with a fixed mindset, you're going to give up very easily. You're not going to be willing to persist. But if you enter into it with a growth mindset, then you'll be willing to embrace challenges and persist in the face of setbacks. So I love the book and the entire concept because I see this play out every day in the career choices we make and how we approach things. So if I think about my own experience, at one point I was working at the Toro Company. I was probably in about 5 years, had some success and some promotions in their international sales and marketing division. And the VP of operations came to me and he sat down in my office and he said, you know, you've been recommended for a job in the operations area. And I approached that with really a fixed mindset, frankly. I said, well, I appreciate being considered. You know, I really didn't even ask, I'm ashamed to even admit this, but I really didn't even ask for that much more information from him. I just, well, you know, I have an MBA and my background is in international and I really like working in the international division. And so thanks for considering me, but I just wasn't convinced or confident enough that I could do the job. And I felt like it wasn't necessarily something that I could learn. And so I think if you can approach your career from the early stages with a growth mindset, if I had pursued that opportunity in operations, my career path may have looked very different because as it turned out, in a couple of years I got restless and I actually left corporate to move on to higher ed, which was a great move for me. Very, very glad I did it. But I think sometimes we close the door too quickly because we have a fixed mindset. And people who approach their career choices with a growth mindset, who have a willingness to learn, a willingness to be open, a willingness to be confident when they're asked to do things, I think they have really interesting and rich careers. And so I would just encourage you to develop a growth mindset. And there are a couple things that can help with this. I love that picture of Curious George that's up there, but to be curious, to learn how to ask good questions. I think one of the most powerful things you can learn to say is, you know, I'm curious about, as an entry point for any conversation you're having, simply because it shows that you're not jumping to conclusions, that you're willing to ask good questions, you're willing to explore and learn more. And I think that's missing very much in a society where the messages that we have right and wrong answers or black and white are definitely out there. So people who demonstrate curiosity are typically highly valued. Secondly, I would just say, again, accept those stretch assignments. My father said to me, guy I have a lot of admiration for, do something that scares you every day. So really move outside your comfort zone, and that's where the magic happens. So I think when we take on new challenges, when we do things that might scare us, we grow and we develop, and we have much more magical experiences. And then do things that help set yourself apart. So whether it be a new task or a skill, or if you identify something within your organization that nobody else is good at, if you can get really good at that, that's a magical thing to be able to set yourself apart and will help you have much more of a growth mindset.
So, and I concur, and I think the distinction on that growth then, so do that as an individual, but then we think and transition to, well, what are my options? And how would I begin to think about framing options? One, it's interesting how many options become immediately available because people start to project you into things you might not even, because they see, well, I gave them A, and they turned that into A plus B, Well, if I gave them something more, what could they turn that into, right? So that's part of building your brand. So if you think about then how do I define alternatives to explore, I tend to give people the following advice. Think a bit about 2 or 3 alternate realities, right? Where do I want to be in, depending on, if your age, in 2, 3, 5, 10 years, right? What kind of path do I want to be on? And I think about it in 3 distinct kinds of paths. One's a path you're on, but moving further down the path. So if you're a marketer at a company, do you want to be the marketing director at that company, right? So what then does it look like to be promoted? And do you understand and have you fully explored what it takes to be successful in the path you're on? And I think that oftentimes people fail to fully explore or maximize the opportunity where they are. And that gets a little bit into leaving too early, which is my next slide. But I think sometimes people leave too early and they don't understand or they underestimate. Or, on the other hand, they haven't explored it and they think it's going to be easier than it really is. So, like when I was at 3M and I ran a group there, I'd have people come in interviews and tell me, well, I'm going to be, at this level in 10 years. And I was like, no, you're not. Like maybe 1 out of 25 of you is. But the median employee is not going to move that fast. That's just not how this organization works. But that's knowable, and you can find it out if you're networking, exploring, doing informational interviews, asking for good advice, finding mentors, all those things we talked about earlier in your existing path. Path 2, in my mind, is sort of a lateral path. So I'm a marketer at 3M, but I'd really like to explore marketing at another company. Okay, well, that's a different kind of networking path, right? I know what direction I'm moving in, and I can figure out kind of who I'd go talk to, but that's very network-driven and some research. It could also be within your own organization. I'm in marketing and I want to shift to operations like Carlene was just talking about, right? Because it may not be obvious to everyone that that switch could work for you given your skill set and functional training, right? Particularly if you're early in your career and you don't have an MBA or you don't have a credential that's required in that other path, how do you network and or earn your way reputationally into those kind of opportunities? So, so again, path you're on, alternate path, and then I think of a third as a divergent path. Right, so, I work at a big company, I want to do a startup. Right, I'm a marketer and I want to run a bakery. I mean, it's so far from the existing experience that you don't even necessarily know what it would look like or how to get going. And in that path, then, once you've articulated it, I think about experiments and figuring out what that journey looks like. So, before you, and my probably not great metaphor is, if you're standing at the top of a cliff and you're debating cliff diving, do you want to just dive into the water or do you want to kind of climb down gradually, stick your toe in the water, see what the temperature is, and see if there's any rocks submerged beneath the surface? That's kind of what I would encourage people to do, not just dive. And I think we can fall into the trap of follow your passion, right? Well, yeah, but does your passion actually generate a positive economic return, right? I mean, I think I encourage you to follow your passion, but with some evidence. In fact, I got asked a really good question by a group of MBAs 3 or 4 years ago, speaking during orientation about career paths and something along this line, and figuring stuff out within a pretty conventional MBA search. And somebody put their hand up and said, "So are you telling us not to pursue our dreams?" I was like, "Oh gosh, no, I would never say that. But what I am saying is pursue your dreams with data." Right? I mean, you should know what your dream looks like. So for me, that meant I actually went into a history PhD program. But before I got to the end of that PhD program, I figured out that I wasn't as passionate about the writing and the research as I thought, and that I could make more money leaving then than I would make as a tenure track assistant professor at any of the schools I could probably get a job at. It's like, well, the economics seem bad, and I'm no longer excited about it, so it's time to go. Right? So define an experiment. So if you want to debate a bakery, why don't you try going to the farmer's market and selling 10 plates of cookies and seeing if you really liked getting up at 4 in the morning to bake, 1 Saturday a month or 2 Saturdays a month before you commit to doing it every day for the rest of your life. Okay? And by the way, these are not fixed paths. The reason I have a picture of sort of a bunch of paths cross-cutting is it's like the picture back at the beginning. None of these are fixed, right? I mean, it's all parallel path exploring, but with a plan. And then, so when is it time to move on? To the earlier question, have you squeezed all the juice out of the lemon? And by that I mean, are you not learning? Is there no next job you're interested in? Have you lost like all energy? You've seen your organization do something that ethically you just aren't okay with. Has the strategy shifted and you're going after a different market than yours? It could be any of a myriad of things. Well, when you feel that way and feel that way persistently for an extended period of time, it's probably time to move on. My checking question on that is I think that particularly early in their career, many people leave things too early, and there's still actually quite a bit of juice left in the lemon, but they're impatient. So to me, it's really a question of rate of learning and growth. To me, it's if you're not really challenged anymore and you're doing the same thing all the time, and you've asked for more and not been given it, or people have told you there's not a promotion or things are saying, then I would consider leaving. But I'd explore that pretty hard and really do an assessment of how much juice is left in that lemon, if that makes sense. I like to torture metaphors, so thanks for bearing with me. So with that, it's all about the money, money, money.
So our final point, and Phil and I have both sat in over the years in a lot of kind of career presentations and follow your dreams, and are honestly, I think, believers in that. And yet what's rarely talked about, and yet what's is incredibly important, is to learn to manage your personal finances and save your money. So if you can learn to do this in your early career, you'll be a lot better off, because as Phil mentioned in the beginning, it leads to wonderful choice. So it sounds trivial to be able to be good at saving your money, but honestly it's not easy. It requires discipline, it requires the ability to set limits for yourself, to save first and spend later. And frankly, as I've thought about this in my young career, it was difficult for me to kind of keep up with my peers, but not always, but make choices where I wasn't keeping up with my peers. So I had peers who were driving, brand new fancy cars, and I kind of continued to drive the plain, practical car that I had gotten from my, parents and handed down to me. Those kinds of things. Really did want to be able to live alone at some point in my life, but I ended up living, for years with roommates because it enabled me to save money, participate in my 401k plan, pay off my student loans, 7 to 8 years early. And so this has led to incredible choice along my entire career. So I transitioned from a corporate job to higher ed, took a significant pay cut, but I loved it. And then I took another pay cut to run a nonprofit association and have more flexibility when we adopted my son. And because I had savings built up, I always had the confidence to be able to move on and know that I was going to be okay financially. And so I highly recommend that you two really focus and concentrate on saving your money to the extent that that is possible.
Yeah, and I would say sometimes the optionality it creates isn't even obvious to you right now, but like I just joined an angel investing group that I hadn't necessarily ever thought I would join because I had accumulated over 20 plus years the ability to participate, right? I can spend a bit of money on the margin, and that's sort of a passion, hobby of mine, but it's also a financial requirement tied up in it. If you want to do a startup, it's much easier if you can cash flow it yourself than if you got to go ask other people for tens of thousands of dollars. It's much easier when you're feeling that unease and unhappiness in a job to move on to something else, again, if the next paycheck isn't the difference of making your mortgage or rent payment or not. Mm-hmm. So with that, a few resources. Carlene mentioned the Mindset book. We both love that book. Johnny Bunko, The Last Career Guide You'll Ever Need, is one we both had students and acquaintances read. It's a manga-style book that has some really, I think, thoughtful advice. Here's a TED Talk that you could click on. And then there's my career blog. I've written a bunch on this if you find it interesting. So with that,
definitely.
Questions?
Thank you, Phil and Carlene. And I'll also put in a plug for Phil's career blog. I've actually gotten a lot of good, useful information off of that. Question. We have an alumnus tuning in from Switzerland, so thank you for joining us. His question is, at what point, if ever, as a young professional, do you need to decide if work-life balance is a personal priority? I feel like that decision needs to be made and it dictates your future and corporate success. Thoughts?
I have a couple thoughts on that. One, I don't think it's a static answer. I think it's a dynamic one, and by that I mean my sense of life balance I'm 46. I'll fess up, if you're on a video, you'd be impressed by the amount of gray in my beard at this point. How I feel as a parent of 3 middle school age kids at 46 is different than how I felt as a 27-year-old graduating from MBA and going to work in management consulting, right? And it's ebbed and flowed. So I think being aware of where you are. I also think it's okay to decide that you want to work 40 hours a week in a job that is interesting but not necessarily demanding of more than that. Just understand the financial trade-offs, right? To me, there's no right answer into how career-oriented to be as long as you've calibrated, you know, the path you're on with what your expectations are. So again, it goes back to some of the savings questions around currently. You know, did you buy, like, I parked my 12-year-old Honda CR-V next to some nicer cars here in the ramp at the business school because I could probably afford a nicer car, but I don't really feel like it because that precludes other opportunities, right? So I think you got to decide how career-oriented are you and then pick jobs that align with that relative to your financial needs, which is sort of an it depends answer, but I think it does depend. And I have friends who are my age who earn good money and it's a job. They don't have passion around a career. They have a job that is fine. They're okay with it, but their whole life is their family. Like, I have a dear friend who's that way. He does what he does to pay for his life, and I think that's fine. But the earlier you're clear about that, to the questioner's point, the easier it is to kind of separate yourself from it and be hard-headed and concrete about the decisions you make relative to that.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add that there have been times early on where I absolutely loved to work. Like, I was so caught up in either the project I was working on or the team I was working on or what I was doing that I loved to work. And frankly, I just rode that out as long as I was able. And then there were other times in my career where, you know, there wasn't as much going on, the learning curve wasn't as steep, and I also rode that out and just really enjoyed traveling, getting connected with a group of young professionals in the Twin Cities, and frankly hanging out a lot more, traveling somewhere almost every weekend, just picking up some new hobbies and learning some things. You know, I've had many experiences where my lifestyle has been more about having fun and kind of personal growth and development, and then other times where it's really been about work because I've just loved what I'm doing. And so I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all that you need to, you know, develop work-life balance right at this moment in time. I think it just ebbs and flows, and you have to pay attention to your energy. And, you know, there's successful people, incredibly successful people who are able to set boundaries and manage their work life. So I would also look for role models and people who do it and do it well. I don't think success is dependent, frankly, on working all the time. I think success is understanding where to put your energies and when you need to take a break and giving yourself permission at that time to take a break.
That is wonderful advice. Anything else, Phil?
No, I was just going to say another metaphor that maybe doesn't directly relate, but is like, I think of mountain peaks and plateaus, right? You climb for a while, and then you get to a plateau, and sometimes you need to hang out on that plateau for a while because you're tired, right? Or you've gotten to a level of stability where you're good at what you do, but you aren't craving the next dollar. So I think just being clear about what's that next plateau for you, and are you on path, or are you okay where you are now?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, both to Carlene and Phil. Truly appreciate the time that you took to be with us today and prepare your webinar. I know that you're both really busy in your respective positions, and just really respect your advice, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you, John.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good luck.
All right, everybody. That concludes our webinar for today. Stay tuned. Later on this summer, we will be rolling out the new series of career and life stage webinars for 2015-16. Until that time, do visit our website, minnesotaalumni.org/alumni webinar series, and all 10, once we get this recording up, all 10 recordings will be up on our website, and you can check those out. Over 2,900 people have already done that across all of our recordings, so check it out. Let us know what you think. And also, if you are on social media, check us out on Twitter. And also, I do want to put in a plug for our LinkedIn group, the University of Minnesota Alumni Association. There's 29,000 people in that group. If you're looking to expand your network or reconnect with others, it's a wonderful place to start, and can really help build out your network and follow up on some of those tips that Carlene and Phil talked about as far as expanding your network and learning more about others' industries through informational interviews or over coffee as well. And in closing, do want to thank the members of the University of Minnesota Alumni Association who make new initiatives like this webinar series possible. Because of our members, we can enrich the lives of alumni, support student success, and make a better University of Minnesota. So consider becoming a member today at minnesotaalumni.org/join. If you're a current student, there's some student discounted rates as well, and also if you're graduating, there's a free year complimentary membership as well. That concludes today's webinar. Thanks again for joining us and being an active member of the worldwide community of University of Minnesota alumni and friends. Have a wonderful day. Ski U Ma, and we'll see you later this summer. Bye.